Let's start the policy debate. How can MSP address many ambitions and challenges? This is the opening session, the policy debate of this forum. And as I mentioned, we will have several speakers as well as several hosts during these days. And so to say, I'm just the digital host or the technology host. We also do have a content host. So it is my great honor to switch or to give the floor to someone sitting quite far from us at the moment. We are digitally traveling to Edinburgh, Scotland, where Rhona Fairgrieve is. Rhona, good morning. I don't hear you at the moment, but I think that is just no worries, that is just a small
Can you hear me now?
And I hear you now. Good morning, Rhona.
Excellent.
Good
morning, Edgars.
I think it's one of the first times for me that I'm hosting the event live/digital together with someone from Scotland. And I guess it's the first experience for you as well.
Very much so. I was watching the Eurovision Song Contest a couple of weekends ago, and now I know exactly how these wonderful moderators feel. And there's a fair level of terror in all of this, but an awful lot of good hope for a wonderful couple of days ahead of us. And I just hope that the technology lasts. I'm sure it will, and I hope that I don't break it. In order to try and bring to you the sessions that I'm moderating from over here. So, without further ado, shall we get on with the opening remarks? And can you see the slide, perhaps?
You mentioned the Eurovision, and who knows, maybe during the get-together event we will play the Ya Ya Ding Dong song. But first we will have to start with the business part, as you mentioned. So the digital floor will be currently yours. If you need any assist on the pool or the work cloud, you just call me in. But otherwise, the digital stage is now yours. Please start.
Thank you. That's grand. Thank you very much. On Ya Ya Ding Dong, just to reflect briefly, I'm terribly sorry not to have been able to get to Riga for this conference, but unfortunately, obviously, current circumstances prevent it. However, I will forever fondly remember one of my first trips to Riga for a karaoke bar session that lasted into the small hours, and it was just a wonderful place to get together with other like-minded maritime spatial planning people. So if you are in the audience, Jan Schmidt-Kroner, or Jan, then hello to everybody. Good morning, officially, from Leith, which is the first of these brief photographs that you can see here. This is the port part of Edinburgh on the Scottish East Coast, and although I may be 2 whole sea basins away from Riga, across both the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, it's clear from our architecture here that I'm not the first to have visited countries around both those 3 basins. And apparently, during the medieval period, and long before even Germany existed as a nation, Scottish traders were doing business with the Netherlands and the Baltic Sea ports of the Hanseatic League. And even the main street in Leith here is still known, or where the shipping companies used to be based, is known as Baltic Street. So there are clear links between where I am now and where you are around the Baltic Sea. And it's wonderful to echo these earlier links again through the wonders of 21st century technology today. It's a pleasure to be joining you for this 4th MSP Forum. You can see in the second group of pictures that I have been to previous versions of it, either as a speaker or a delegate or a demonstrator of the MSP Challenge game, and now here I am as a moderator. It's a real privilege to have been asked to help out, and I'm delighted to be able to do so. I've been asked to set the scene for the 2 days, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what has been happening to implement the MSP directive. And I confess more than a passing interest in what happens with this directive, because even though the UK government may have left the EU. In 2013, I was seconded to DG Environment from the Scottish Government to be part of the directives negotiating team. And the second group of photographs on the top line are indicative of the huge number of people who put time and effort into producing the MSP directive. So if you are struggling with it, I'm afraid, these are the people who are directly responsible for it. And I will pay tribute to my former colleague from DG Mari, Sylvain Gombert, who's in the little group of photographs from earlier MSP Fora days, and Gesine Meisner, the MEP, who really is the mother of the MSP directive. We've also heard a bit this morning already about land-sea interactions, and Lodewijk Abspoel, who's in that little picture there, is one of the people directly responsible for creating this concept of LSI from the remains of what was integrated coastal management when that didn't manage to get into the directive. But we have a wonderful piece of legislation, and it's encouraging you all to think positively and cohesively in joining up what happens on land with what happens at sea, because of course the two of them are directly interlinked. Enough about looking behind, more about looking ahead. And we are looking today about what is happening around the Baltic Sea area as we progress from where we have been, the comfortable realities of what we have known about, into a little bit of the more uncharted territories. We are thinking about what MSP can do to help, a tool by which many other actions can be achieved. And it's not just the delivery of economic development balanced with environmental protection. It's now available to assist the post-COVID-19 reconstruction situation, including climate change resilience and the decarbonisation agenda, with research and development included across and between all different sectors. A little picture about flags there was taken in my last meeting of the heads of delegation meeting at One Helcom when I was still working with the Commission. And I use it to illustrate, obviously, that the Baltic Sea is totally unique in its collection of countries, both within and out with the EU, and Alda has already made reference to that. Each of their own approaches to management of their own marine resources, but with using existing frameworks and mechanisms already to facilitate joined-up approaches, not only to MSP, as we've heard, but other connected aspects such as data facilitation and stakeholder engagement. So the Baltic Sea area can teach others what has worked for you and take on board what has been put around elsewhere. And I was very pleased to hear that recognition, because knowledge exchange is part and parcel of these wonderful events. A picture about Blondie. Well, there's an explanation there. I've included this to set the scene in tribute to my former boss from the Scottish Government, a gentleman called David Palmer, who drove through Scotland's groundbreaking marine legislation and set the scene for a planning regime that now encompasses not only a statutory national marine plan, but sectoral marine plans for offshore wind energy and regional marine plans for areas like the Shetland Islands. And I include it because he once broke my iPod on a very long car journey trying to find more and more music by Blondie, which he thought was the only one of the 4,000 albums that I had on the iPod that was actually worth listening to. But the idea about parallel lines has stuck with me, because although we all exist in our own areas and we all exist to fulfill our own objectives, so we might work in parallel lines, the point about marine planning or maritime spatial planning is that it makes us work together. Those parallel lines need to converge across sectors and across borders and boundaries, and we need a mechanism to make that happen, and that's maritime spatial planning. So I'll leave you with the last little picture there, which is my Riga knot in I think the second MSP forum that I attended, and here is the original. We tied these at the social event as a fun thing to do to get everybody working together, and I took mine home as a permanent reminder. It reminds me of good working cooperation across sea basins every time I look at it. And even although we may work in parallel to deliver our own responsibilities and what is required within our own countries and across vastly different areas of interest, MSP ultimately ties us all together. So I will be working as a moderator to help tie together some of the ideas that we come up with, some of the speakers. We're about to start into a policy debate at this stage, but I'll also be joining you throughout the rest of the conference to moderate some of the other sessions, and it's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you at the end of tomorrow, by which time I imagine we will have covered quite a considerable amount of ground. So I wish you a very good virtual conference, and it's lovely to be speaking to you from sunny Leith today. Okay, Edgars, I think that's about it. Are we okay for the next part?
Absolutely.
Hello.
Thank you for the nice introduction. It was great to hear your experience. Actually, I wanted to introduce your experience on my side, but then I understood that we would need a special forum just to explain everything you have done in the last 25 years. So thank you for doing it yourself. And I also have to say that when you mentioned your home city, Edinburgh, do you know that one of the beautiful coastal parts of Latvia, meaning Jūrmala, previously was called Edinburgh?
No, I did not. Really?
So here's the fact of the day. The next time when you come to Latvia, I'm not sure we're going to go to a karaoke bar, but we're definitely going to go to Jūrmala, and I will share you the story why Jūrmala was previously partly called Edinburgh. But that is another story. First, as we mentioned, we will have to start with the policy debate. And Rhona, I know that you have lots of great speakers who will be joining you online in this part of the event, and I will give the floor back to you to introduce all of them.
Thank you very much. Well, no, I certainly did not know about Jūrmala and the Edinburgh connection, but I will very much look forward to finding that out on my next visit to Riga, whenever that might be. Right, the policy debate then. Let's move along. Policy of this session is to briefly consider where we have been in terms of MSP, but also to look ahead and see what the challenges will be over the next decade or so, up to 2030, and then beyond that to 2050. And we hope that you'll be able to take away key messages about what's important to get right now so that we can deliver what is required in future years. We have 3 key representatives from different sectors to contribute to this debate, representing governance, maritime industry stakeholders, and the data community. And as you can see from the agenda, we're joined by Felix Leinemann, who's head of unit in DG Mare with responsibility for maritime spatial planning, Iván Pineda, the Director of Public Affairs for WindEurope, a trade association promoting wind power in Europe, and Professor Markus Meier, the head of the Physical Oceanography and Instrumentation Department at the Leibniz Institute for the Baltic Sea Research in Warnemünde, Sweden. So, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. This is terrific. And to borrow the old metaphor of a 3-legged stool as a means of explaining sustainability, each of the 3 elements of governance, data and stakeholders is an absolutely essential component in delivering successful MSP. So I'll be asking you some questions over the course of the next few minutes, and I invite you to offer some reflections in our discussions on how MSP can address the many ambitions and challenges relating to the sustainable use of marine resources around Europe. So to begin with, I'll ask you to say a few words of personal introduction and then give a very short answer to this single common question. So Felix, I'll come to you first, and then Iván, and then Markus. So the question is, if we think about how different activities involve living and non-living resources, along with multiple stakeholders who presumably are living and all have an interest in MSP, what is your general ambition or specific goal for MSP in the European Union over the next decade? Felix, to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Rhona, and good morning, everyone from Brussels. I'm very honored to have been invited to this panel. You already introduced me, so I don't think I need to say any words. I wasn't there when the directive was negotiated, but I was there when the deadline for its implementation fell on the 31st of March 2021, and we will come to that a bit later. Now, let's not look back, but let's look ahead. So what would I like to see over the next decade? I would like to see maritime spatial planning evolve from a novelty concept to a standard approach to any activity at sea, be it traditional or emerging. By then, I think that currently emerging activities or activities that are only at the exploration stage, like farming mollusks or seaweed between offshore wind farms, should have become standard approaches. I would also like to see any economic activities at sea combined with the objective of nature restoration, artificial reefs, nursery or spawning grounds for fish, seafloor restoration, so that we'll be able to reach the double objective of climate action and biodiversity conservation or even restoration. So by 2030, we will have seen the second generation of maritime spatial plans by all coastal states in the European Union and beyond, probably in the UK as well. Ideally, I think that those will be plans with a purpose and a vision, and not only drawing boards that are sketching up how to distribute current uses. And as that purpose, MSP will have delivered the objective to have at least 60 gigawatt of offshore wind in EU waters and to protect 30% of maritime space as protected areas by 2030. That will be my look ahead. You're mute.
Sorry, I'm still getting to grips with these. No, that would be a terrific end result, or a terrific staging post as part of an ongoing process. Wonderful. Thank you very much for those reflections. Iván, what would you like to contribute to the debate? What's your general ambition or specific goal for MSP over the next decade?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this debate. I can see a lot of smiles. It's very good, and at very early in the morning, people is smiling, although it's almost 10 a.m. But I've been in many debates where people is just not smiling. But it's good. It means that MSP is a happy topic. Let me say, and I'm going to quote your commissioner, Felix. I'm going to quote Virginia Sinkevicius. He said, "Well, there is no green without blue." And this is extremely important. The blue economy has to be at the center, at the right and the left of everything that we have to do over the next decade. This is the view of the wind energy industry, particularly for offshore. MSP by 2030 should have at least gone 2 rounds of exercises in all member states. Okay? And same as Felix said, it should be proposing long-term visions. Not only the mandatory at least 6 years in advance or at least 6 years revision, but having a very long-term vision. What is going to happen after 2030? So during the next decade, governments need to think about that, not only distributing space at sea, but as Felix said, but having that purpose. And that purpose is very important because today MSP is seen as an administrative item that governments need to comply for the European Commission. Only 6 governments actually met the deadline set by Felix on the 31st of March. So the way forward is very simple. In the next decade, all member states must do their MSP work in the same vein as Felix said. Importantly for our industry, which is going to create a revolution in the transition towards cleaner energy, MSP, Maritime Spatial Planning, needs to be closely aligned with the national energy and climate plans. This is something that is still not really close tied. We need to ensure that whenever governments are proposing very high ambitions on renewables, they come to the experts in MSP and say, how we're going to do it? Is it going to be joint up approach, or are we going to fight between our ministries that are looking at MSP and renewables, how to make it? So we need to be installing, just to give you an idea, we're installing around 3 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. Okay, we need to be installing 7 gigawatts a year as from 2024. And we need to be preparing to even increase that to 10 gigawatts per year in 2030. So that's all fine and good. You say, of course, WindEurope is going to talk about installations, but what does that mean when it comes to allocating space at sea? And it's not only exclusive allocation. We'll speak about co-location and multiple use. But what it means is for planners that they need to start planning how we are going to get, on average, a very broad number of around 670 square kilometers per year for activities of renewable energy generation as from 2030. That's extremely important, and that's the challenge. So
that sounds, just on that point, we are coming back to a second round of questions, but I'd like to thank you very much indeed for that contribution. But if I may stop you there and bring in Markus, what's your ambition for the next few years? And then we'll have a look ahead about what happens thereafter. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from the wonderful Östergötland in Sweden. Rhona, please allow me a small correction. The Leibniz Institute in Baltic Sea Research in Warnemünde is located in Germany, but the confusion might arise because I'm living in Sweden, and you see here the fantastic view, and I'm also affiliated at the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute. So I have a long way to work, actually, usually, but yeah, it's a very fine situation. So to your question, well, I see science as a measure for producing scientific supporting material for MSP. So what we are going to do is to introduce the climate change aspect more into the planning. And for that, you need reliable knowledge. And this can only be achieved from models that we are applying for projecting the future of the Baltic Sea. Then this material can be used for the planning. And the models are, of course, erroneous and uncertain and need to be developed further. So we have to look into the past. So we are investigating past trends in the Baltic Sea to get an idea how climate change might already have affected the Baltic Sea. And with that knowledge, we try to improve from the Maritime environmental monitoring program our models and try to get to better supporting material from the models for the future and for the next decades for MSP. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies for getting your countries mixed up. I do apologise. But thank you for that. And thank you for all three of you for your introductory remarks. That's given us a real flavour of the issues that are currently under consideration and also the value of what has gone in the past in terms of the data and the modelling to predict what may go ahead in the future. And make no mistake, we are dealing with cutting edge technologies. We are dealing with 21st century issues in terms of climate change and many other different things. So we are well placed, but I liked the idea of MSP moving from a novelty aspect into something that was just part and parcel of everyday life. That's something with which I can definitely agree. We're going to move on to the next section at this point, which is particular questions related to each of you in connection with your own direct area of interest. So back to Felix again, you're first up for this. And the question is, has the implementation of the MSP directive changed from what was envisaged in 2014 when it was first agreed? And I take on board the point that you weren't around at that point when it was negotiated. But is the Commission content with the level of implementation across Europe? Over to you. You have about 10 minutes for this, if that's okay.
10. Okay, I was going to be a bit briefer, and then I thought you were going to ask a follow-up, whatever. I mean, as I said,
yes.
I wasn't there, but I've met a lot of people who were present. I've been constantly reminded by the likes of Lodewijk or you of how the negotiations went and so on. So it's not that it is a total secret to me. But if I look back, and now looking back at 2014, out of the 23 coastal member states of the European Union, just 3 had something that could be considered a maritime spatial plan for their waters. Probably there were coastal plans, but for their waters, only 3 of them. But since then, and today it's only 22 coastal member states, but all these coastal member states have established a vision for the use of their waters. They have discussed it with stakeholders, they have discussed it with their neighbors, they have put in place administrative and political processes to establish and agree upon a maritime spatial plan, and most of them for the first time ever. And this is, I think, a terrific achievement in only 7 years to have come this far, because these are immensely complex processes, and all your planners out there, you know what this is about and what this means, and the stakeholders know what this is about as well. And I think we can be very proud that Europe or the European Union is the first region in the world to have achieved this. We are also setting an example in terms of international ocean governance in that sense. Now, the directive has an expectation because it sets legal deadlines. First of all, the deadline of the 31st of March of this year for the establishment of the plans. And then there is still a little buffer of 3 months that member states have from the establishment of the plan to the communication to the Commission. This means that we will only have the full picture or first full picture by the end of June. And we have indeed positive news from a handful, maybe a bit more, of member states to have established their maritime spatial plans by the deadline. We have another group of quite positive news from many others who are on their way, but where implementation has run into some delays. For example, due to delayed stakeholder consultations due to the pandemic, which came right at the moment when all these consultations were normally going to be put into place. There have been government changes that come at the moment when the plan was due to be adopted. Overall, these are long and complex processes which can run into delays. But I'm quite confident that most of the member states will have adopted their plans before the end of this year. We have a few where the processes have not yet brought the intended results, and we do not yet know when the plans will actually be adopted. But at least the processes have been put in place.
That's now, very. Sorry, I was just going to say that's very encouraging. That's great. Sorry, do continue.
Yeah, but just to sum up that, I think, of course, the Commission is the guardian of the treaty. It will watch whether or not member states have implemented their plans. But I think that overall, as Iván said, we are smiling here, and I think we have reason to celebrate, because also this has brought the importance of the sea into political processes and into stakeholder processes, and that's what has been important.
That's fantastic. So what are you aware of? What's turned out to be important for member states when they have developed their approaches to maritime spatial planning? Is it the support mechanisms that have been put in place, or the transboundary cooperation projects that have been set up? Have any of these played into the processes that have come forward? Mm-hmm.
I would say it's a combination of many of these things, of course. But firstly, the MSP directive sets a minimum framework, and it leaves a lot of room for maneuver to member states. I mean, we have member states where it is the Environment Ministry that is in charge. In other member states, it's the Ministry of Transport. In other member states, like Estonia, it's the Finance Ministry. So at least that was the case until the last government changed. I don't know whether that has changed in the meantime. Same for the administrative organization. We have countries where local and regional authorities have a very strong role, and that's posing quite a headache how to set up the concept. So, of course, this is also up to member states to tell us, but I hope that the EU MSP platform, which is an assistance mechanism that the Commission has funded under the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund since a number of years, has been helpful also for national MSP processes. The idea of this platform is to be a knowledge hub for MSP, to support member states upon request, to offer toolboxes, dedicated studies, workshops, conferences on specific topics like on small sea spaces, on land-sea interaction, and so on. Then, of course, another support that the Commission has made available are the transboundary MSP projects in a given sea basin. We have good examples from the Baltic with Baltic Scope and Pan-Baltic Scope. But we have funded these projects in each sea basin. And by the way, we will hear about a future project in the course of today. These projects have brought together maritime spatial planners from neighboring countries to compare notes, compare data, try to make cumulative impact assessment, consult across borders, develop a joint vision. So now in the next step, I think we should be able to make the combination of national member states' plans visible and accessible through a common and interoperable data portal that will allow viewing plans at sea basin level. We have some ideas for that, but this would ideally combine the economic uses of the sea with environmental protection objectives.
Wow, that sounds a very innovative approach, but very useful as well, because that's the level of information that's required when people from across a number of different marine activities are seeking the information that they need. And this leads me quite neatly on to my next question then, which is, are there any sectors or aspects that have emerged in the last 8 years for which maritime spatial planning will be useful over the next decades?
Definitely, and I'm not sure that this was in the minds of the legislators at the time, probably, because you couldn't foresee many things. What has emerged, for example, from the cross-border projects is the question of data for MSP. How can you make this visible, and how can you make the data interoperable? Every country has its own system. There have been things developed at sea basin level, but from these cross-border projects, there was a sort of a bottom-up movement saying, can we not make this more comparable and visible? And a working group of planners and data specialists from almost all member states, from all these sea basins, came together and agreed on common interoperable standard that will make it possible to make the plans visible, for example, through EMODnet, but also through other systems that are then compatible. That in turn will lead to more ocean literacy, not just for planners, but for politicians in general. If you can see such a plan at sea basin level, that makes a big difference. When you're asking about specific sectors, I would say there are sectors that rely very much on efficient MSP. And Iván has made the point very strongly. Offshore renewable energy is dependent on effective and forward-looking maritime spatial planning. But also aquaculture. Aquaculture is in need of space. Multi-use in general, how to combine different elements, that's a matter of planning. Then also the development of ports as hubs for a sustainable blue economy and how they are going to develop the maritime economy. But with the debate on offshore wind, we've also seen fisheries much more interested in maritime spatial planning, as they thought the sea was all theirs. But they felt neglected, and they are feeling driven out. So they also need to be taken into account in these processes.
That's a very good point, yes, to be inclusive and not to be exclusive wherever possible. Thank you for that. And I can assure you that when we did go through the negotiations, we weren't aware of just how many new and evolving opportunities there would be within that sector. So it's we were coping with what we were dealing with at the time, perhaps with a little less of the forward plan. But my final point to you then is, it's been mentioned already, the new European Union Green Deal to help us recover from where we are at the moment. How can MSP help to deliver the goals that are set out in the EU Green Deal? Just briefly.
Very briefly, I mean, and Iván already mentioned it as well. I think the first thing is decarbonization. If we want to achieve an installed capacity of 300 gigawatt of offshore renewable energy by 2050, we will need to identify and use a much larger number of sites for offshore renewable energy production. And for this, we need long-term planning by public authorities that assess the environmental, the social and economic sustainability and ensure the coexistence with other activities. Designated sea spaces for offshore energy exploitation should be compatible with biodiversity protection, and that is the other big element. Taking into account socioeconomic consequences for sectors that rely on the good health of marine ecosystems and integrate other uses of the sea. How should we achieve this without MSP, would be my question back. So it's really a tool that you need to anticipate change, prevent and mitigate conflicts. And I'm hopeful that through an ecosystem-based approach, we will, with MSP, achieve at the same time the protection of biodiversity, and thus also contribute to the other objective, which is one of it. Decarbonization and biodiversity are the main objectives of the Green Deal.
Thank you for that. Beautifully summarised right at the end. That's terrific. Thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, Iván, we've heard there about the importance of the offshore renewable energy agenda, both in terms of achieving decarbonisation overall, but also as a fundamental part of forward planning within maritime spatial planning. So my question to you in relation to this is, do offshore wind developers prefer to be guided to areas of good wind resource that have already been identified, perhaps as part of the maritime spatial planning process, or do they prefer to find their own areas of potential sites for development? How would you think about that?
Thank you. Well, offshore developers are normally best placed to identify the high wind resource areas. No? Nevertheless, the central approach for allocating area at sea and allocating space at sea is very helpful. It helps to coordinate stakeholders' views, as Felix mentioned, and it expedites the deployment of offshore wind. Now, there are only two countries in Europe that have the so-called open door procedure, where a developer basically is able to go and propose a project without undergoing an allocation, a pre-allocation from the government, and that's Denmark and Sweden. But it is important that governments help to perform the large-scale surveys on wind resource, but also other elements. Wind resource assessments is something that developers will have to do anyway individually for their business case. Okay, so the government doing this exercise is very helpful for them to design, for example, their auctions, to compare the amount of energy that they will be getting versus their targets, and also to make sure that they have a good economic return on the use of a space in terms of energy. But there are other elements that governments can do when allocating areas at sea for offshore wind. And this includes a lot of the data that probably Markus is going to tell us about, but having a lot of met-ocean surveys, having seabed conditions, characteristics, telling us where are unexploited orders, the so-called UXOs, and other factors that will influence whether we can set up an offshore wind farm or not. And all these will have a cost, obviously, for developers. Now, they must include also some sort of analysis of the current uses, and this is part of MSP. What is the current use of this area at sea where we are planning to put offshore wind? Yes, they will designate it in the MSP process, but what was the use before? Who could be the affected stakeholders, either nature or other economic activities that need to be considered? So that central planning is essential, and we do see that there is very helpful. And governments are the best place to do that. They have the full overview. They could allocate these macro areas for offshore wind, and then the developers can do the detailed analysis of the wind resource. But by delimiting already and allocating an area is helping to expedite the consenting process, lower the risks for investments, and also lower possible opposition. So obviously governments are also very much invited to consult with stakeholders when they designate these areas, as a very first touch point, and not leave it to the developer to sort out once that we have allocated the area. That's what I can tell about the preferential approach, or the preferred approach for allocating offshore wind areas.
That's very interesting. So you're mentioning constraints mapping and the work that can be done by governments to assist developers in potential areas right the way across. Wonderful. So therefore, okay, so if that's what government can do to help you, it comes back in the other way around. Governments are setting decarbonisation targets and ambitions for achieving net zero by 2050. So I apologise for cutting you off in your earlier part, but you were talking about the areas of seabed that are going to be required to help facilitate all the new areas that are going to be needed. So how can maritime spatial planning help to deliver renewable energy targets then and work towards the decarbonisation agenda? How can the two aspects work together?
Well, definitely this is about multi-use. This is about collocation of different economic activities at sea. MSP can help all these activities to be in a happy coexistence. That's what we call a happy coexistence. And offshore wind and the industry is striving to get this happy coexistence with other economic sectors, mainly with fishermen, but also with nature conservation. And let's not forget about our ministries of defense and the military that also make a big use of the sea use. So having a good MSP means that we can have this happy coexistence between sea users. And let me give you an example. Offshore wind developers factor always the views of the fishermen as part of the pre-construction and environmental impact assessments. In most of the countries, we have a very positive relationship with fishermen. There are obviously conflicts in specific areas. So far, only in France, we have seen a very big resistance with fishermen, but collaboration here is critical. It's critical for the safe coexistence of fishermen because the operations at sea of these offshore wind farms can pose a risk to them during construction. So a lot of the temporary measures that we set up around the construction sites are also for safety at sea. But we support very much the exchange with fishermen of real-time data with exact locations of the wind farms where we are going to locate. We share with them the maps for the security zones where they can still perform their activities. And we value a lot the fishermen understanding of the marine environment. We utilize in many countries their expertise and the unique set of skills to assess, for example, marine observations, to help us to identify where are species that could be identified prior to make the pre-construction work. They collect data, they do patrolling. So we have this very strong collaboration with fishermen. And when it comes to nature protection, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. That's absolutely true, to reduce some of the environmental impacts that we have during the construction and operation of the wind farms. But we are starting to better understand the positive effects. It's not only the negative, but the very positive effects. And Felix mentioned, the artificial reef effect that many wind farms are having, studying for how long these benefits can last, what will happen when we decommission with the wind turbines. Will that effect of, will immediately disappear? How much, the species will have regenerated.
Okay.
That we can do.
Thank you for that. That's very good to know about the combinations and the proactive work that you're undertaking. Markus, I'm going to move on to you. I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to be the worst host in the world to overrun with the very first session. But we've heard quite a lot about the importance of data and the different sources from where it comes to, for example, working with fishermen to try and access their data. Your question, what are the outstanding gaps in data and research that would help put maritime spatial planning into action?
Okay, thank you for this question. I think I introduce a little bit more the general setting. I'm a scientist working with models and data, and there I, of course, observe all the data gaps. But I'm also participating in a network called Baltic Earth, a science network focusing on Earth system science. The Baltic Earth program started as under the name Baltex in the 90s, a sub-program of GVEX under the WMO. And what we are doing is organizing conferences, networking, workshops, and so on. But we are doing also assessments of knowledge. And this means that we are producing for the Baltic Sea region some regional IPCC. And from this, it is not only a report about the individual scientists, what we believe, but it is built upon consensus and dissensus. So what we try with these assessments really to find the common knowledge gaps, what we can be sure of, what we cannot be sure of. Where's the scientific dissensus? And this we would disseminate. I give you two examples. So I think there are no special regions really where you can identify that. But say about the wind, because we have Iván here, and wind is of course an important parameters. But if we look at the projections of the models, the wind changes are different in the different models. So there's no robust change over the Baltic Sea surface. There's one exception in regions where the ice is on average melting. So say the Botnian Sea, where we expect an increase of the wind speed. But otherwise, you find different publications on increasing or decreasing wind. And the other example would be bottom oxygen concentration, which is very important for marine habitats, of course. There we expect in the very deep parts of the Baltic Sea an improving trend. I mean, you all know that today that the Baltic Sea suffers from that bottom, so oxygen depletion in the deep, and the nutrient loads to the Baltic Sea were reduced since the 80s, and we expect, due to this reduction and the further implementation of nutrient reductions from HELCOM, from the Baltic Sea Action Plan, an improvement in oxygen conditions. But for the coastal regions, it's a little bit more tricky. There, the climate change effect will cause warmer water, less oxygen, larger stratification, so more oxygen conditions. So there we expect an increase. And but if we look at the models, these trends are rather faint. And there is a large natural variability in the system. And really to say this, we can already observe an improvement or in the deep water or in a worsening in the coastal zone requires very long records from the past and also reliable model projections for the future. And for the past, we have a few. We are very lucky in the Baltic Sea. But it is not enough, actually, for this because of the large natural variability. And for the models, we need actually large ensembles. And here we are trying our best to do it, but I think we are not there that we can really address the complete uncertainty of the parameters of interest.
Gosh, what I'm always in awe of scientists who are able to whip up amazing pieces of data or to extrapolate views ahead from what has gone in the past. And you say you're very lucky to have long data series, long time series from around the Baltic area, which, but yes, even still more is required for looking ahead. So with that in mind, Donald Rumsfeld famously talked about unknown unknowns. So when it comes to data for MSP, which areas have the unknown unknown aspect applied to them?
As I said, I think it's very dependent on the parameter. So you cannot really point out the special region, set the coastal region. I mean, the coastal region, there is the largest interest, of course, because the people are living at the coast. But we have also a large variability and maybe not the long record. So I really would like to emphasize the key in this is to have long monitoring records. I started with the example, or give you the example, bottom oxygen concentration. I mean, wind glaciation started at the end of the 19th century, and we have data since that time, but just a few locations, just a few records. And this we need to analyze to understand what has been happened in the past, to build models, to project it into the future. So again, it is hard to pinpoint a certain region. It depends really on the parameter of the interest that you have on the marine ecosystem or more on the physical parameters. But overall, it is actually the projections are tied to large uncertainties. And this is due to natural variability that we cannot do anything about that. And of course, the second is about differences in the models. Here we can do it. We can try to do better. But we have somehow to estimate these uncertainties.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm sure there are lots of people out in our virtual audience who will be nodding their heads furiously at that point. I see that we are very nearly out of time for this session. I had asked our participants to prepare a question to ask one to each other, but I don't want to, as I said, go into the next session and steal time for that. So what I hope we might do perhaps, excuse me, is be able to, if you tell me the questions that you were going to ask, drop me a quick email, and then I'll perhaps find a way of working those into the rest of the programme on another level or another platform. But thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. All three have given us very valuable food for thought. We've covered a huge amount of ground, from the framework for the legislation and the intentions way back in 2013-14, right up to the industries of the future and what's required in order to meet decarbonisation targets that I can assure you were not thought of way back when. But then again, in 2013, I never ever thought that my own country was going to be a third country in relation to Article 12 of the directive. We're just not going to mention that. So my other concluding remarks, but the data, the importance of it from past experience and making models that are fit for purpose for the future, I think is an uplifting note on which to end this particular policy debate. So my thanks to you all. Edgars, have we got any points coming in from the wider audience at this point before we move on to the next session?